Hi, you guys. Welcome back to the salon. So, I've talked about kind of horror adjacent animated films on here before. Like I discussed Rock and Rule, When the Wind Blows, that weird Japanese anime Jack and the Beanstalk. But it was actually my kind of recent video that I did about the Chuck Jones Rudyard Kipling adaptations that actually sort of gave me the idea to do this video. And it kind of got my mind going back to childhood and back to those Saturday mornings and like after school kind of, afternoons where you would watch these blocks of classic Looney Tunes shorts. Now, while I loved all of the golden era, I guess, cartoons, and in particular the ones that were directed by Chuck Jones and Friz Freleng, I would always get like even more excited whenever one of the kind of spookier cartoons came on, like one of the shorts that had, Gossamer in it or Witch Hazel or something like that. So I got the idea to go back and revisit some of these, really treasured childhood memories, I guess. Now, happily for me, I very, very easily found 10 shorts that I wanted to feature in this video. And not only that, but almost all of them, I think all but one of them, were available to watch uncut, uncensored, blah, 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 on HBO Max. And I'm actually thrilled to report, too, that even though I hadn't seen them for many, many years, all of them were just as fun and just as hilarious as I remembered them being. Now, one small caveat, actually like a couple small caveats, though. Now, I know that maybe a couple cartoons that you might be expecting to appear aren't actually on this list. For example, like any short that has Marvin the Martian in it, or, the one with the abominable snowman, the one with like Bugs and Daffy in it. I did originally have those on the roster, but then I found out that their inclusion on the list would put me way past the 10 cartoon limit, and this video is going to be long enough as it is. And anyway, I was going to say, like, as much as I love the Marvin Martian shorts, they're actually more kind of like funny sci-fi than being like horror adjacent. And the one with the abominable snowman, likewise was just kind of like played for laugh. And it was actually more a parody of like of Mice and Men than being like a monster thing. So I figured I wanted to focus more on shorts that were very specifically horror influenced, ones that had witches, vampires, mad scientists, haunted houses, devil's hell, that kind of stuff. And even with all those provisos, I have to say I did actually still forget a couple, which I'll get into in a little bit. And I just do kind of feel like I'll probably have to do like a second volume of these like one of these days. That always happens. Like as much as I kind of like look into, and there was like some that immediately like popped into mind, but then as I was researching it, like I was like, oh yeah, that one, and oh yeah, that one. And then like by the time I was done like watching the shorts, and then I found like a bunch of different ones, and I was like, well shit, I probably should have included that one too. So I probably will do a volume 2 of this at some point in the future. So without further delay, I'll can the balloon juice, as Bugs Bunny would say, and I'll get into the list. This is actually in no particular order. These are just the order that I kind of thought of them and the order that I watched them in. So, Satan's Waitin', which is a great fucking title. I had completely forgotten about this one until I went digging around. And then when I watched it, like almost the entire thing came back to me like in crystal clarity. This was a very delightful experience, I have to say, that I found repeated with pretty much every one of these. Because like I said, when I was a kid, I saw these millions of times, but I hadn't seen them for at least 25 years, probably longer. So it was funny how ingrained like so many of them were in my brain. Like as soon as I watched them, like I remembered everything about them. So Satan's Waitin' was released in 1954 and was directed by Friz Freleng, as a lot of these are. Most of these were directed by Chuck Jones or Friz Freleng, like most of my favorite ones were. And it's a little over 7 minutes long. Like I said, most of the shorts about 6 or 7 minutes. So this one actually starts with Sylvester chasing Tweety, as he does. That's kind of his whole bag. Only in the course of this pursuit, he ends up falling off like a really, really tall building and essentially like smashing into the sidewalk, cracking the sidewalk, and dying. Which one very funny part is when Tweety is like, "Ooh, you're in trouble. You broke the sidewalk." He's like fucking died. It's like super funny. So he's dead on the sidewalk. Yeah, it's a little dark. And so his spirit like comes out his body, And then like there's kind of this set of partially transparent like escalators appearing in front of him. Now there's one that's all like celestial and golden and whatnot, and that one clearly goes up to heaven. And then there's like a scary like red and black one that's, you know, very obviously going down to hell. Now the heaven one is roped off, you know, like an exclusive nightclub. So hilariously, like Sylvester just goes, oh well, and then like very amiably like rides down to the hell the hell escalator. Like instead of just maybe like stepping over the velvet rope like to go to the heaven one. I mean, maybe deep down like Sylvester thought that he deserved perdition, so he was like, oh, just resign to his fate or whatever. So once he gets down to the netherworld, he discovers that this presumably cat-specific hell is presided over by the recurring character. He was in a bunch of other shorts too. He's called Hector the Bulldog, but in this version he's red and he's wearing like a satanic cape, so he looks like the devil. And he's credited as Devil Dog in this one, at least according to the Looney Tunes wiki, which was like a huge help in researching like the background of all of these cartoons. So it was like really a good resource. I also especially love the little detail that like the lake of fire, there's like a lake of fire and Sylvester like turns around and looks in it like all scared. And it's also filled with all these smaller like red snarling bulldogs that like jump out of the flames and stuff. I thought that was really funny. So anyway, since cats have 9 lives, as everyone knows, Sylvester actually gets sent back to Earth. And at first, because he kind of, you know, got shit scared out of him because he went to hell because he lost 1 life, he thinks that he's going to forego racking up further lost lives by, he's like, yeah, I'm not going to chase Tweety around anymore because, you know, we see how that goes wrong. But the Devil Dog keeps like popping up and convincing him to keep chasing Tweety. So basically like the bulk of the chase happens, like it goes through an amusement park, and Sylvester like keeps getting killed in like kind of humorously but still sort of like gruesome if you think about it, like sort of ways. Like he gets scared to death in a fun house, like he get like his white, like the scared soul like pops just right out of him. He gets blasted a bunch of times in a shooting gallery. He gets hit by a roller coaster, and at one point, like the best one, he gets flattened by a steamroller, which I thought was like super funny. So like when that life goes down into hell, he's all smushed. So finally, when he only has 1 life remaining, he goes like full on prepper and he stocks up like all these cans of cat food and stuff, and he seals himself into a bank vault like for safety, I guess, so he doesn't get killed again. Unfortunately for him though, it so happens that there are 2 robbers who are trying to breach the bank vault, and they end up using too much dynamite and it blows up, and it sends like all 3 of them, even the 2 humans, back down to cat hell. I'm not really sure how that works out. And apparently now they're all going to spend it down there in eternal torment. So, you know, repeated cat death and infernal hellfire. It's fun for the whole family. By the way, and this is something I'll get into as we go on too, because the Looney Tunes wiki, like I said, which is really, really good resource for all of these cartoons, has usually, if the cartoons, which some of them did, like run into like censorship issues, like it would usually say what those were, even though as far as I'm aware, like the versions of them that were on HBO Max and the versions of them that turn up like on Boomerang or Cartoon Network or something like that, as far as I know, those are uncut. I don't think there's anything in at least any of the ones that I watched that's still gone, because when I read the synopsis, like all of the controversial material was still in there. But when CBS aired this particular short, Satan's Waitin', the parts showing Sylvester getting killed by the roller coaster, that was kind of like cut short. Like you still knew what was happening, like it was still implied, but they kind of just like cut out the part where he got smushed by the roller coaster. And it also took out like the whole entire ending with the bank robbers and the deadly explosion, like where they got blown up. So it basically just stopped like after he got hit by the roller coaster and he only had 1 life left, and he's like, yeah, fuck this, I'm not like chasing Tweety anymore, and then it ended. But actually, like the real cartoon, which like I said, the version on HBO Max does have it, has him losing his last life and going to hell like forever after the bank vault explosion. But that was one of the censorship things. And like I said, I'll get into that with some of the other shorts too, if any of them had problems with censorship at any point. So this next one, Hide and Go Tweet. This was another Tweety and Sylvester short. This one was from 1960. And this one actually starts with Sylvester, and he's like sleeping on this ledge of this tall building. between two office windows that are very clearly marked Dr. Jekyll. So you know, like, pretty much where this is going. So as he's sleeping, the very small, mild-mannered looking Dr. Jekyll steps into his office and very casually just quaffs this glass of his Hyde formula, which is like in this big bottle, which he's left sitting on his desk in his unlocked office, like, for all the world to see. I mean, maybe lock it up in a cabinet. It's kind of dangerous, you know, just a suggestion. But anyway, then, unsurprisingly, he turns into a monster whose cackling actually wakes up Sylvester. But by the time that Sylvester, like, looks back through the window, Dr. Jekyll is kind of, like, turned back into his little milquetoast self again. The funniest part of this to me, like, it's always, like, these little random things. And I think the reason that these cartoons are still funny and, like, people still watch them nowadays, even though they're, you know, like, decades old at this point, is just this little attention to detail, like, just these little funny random, like, gags or, like, moments that they wouldn't even have to put in there, but the fact that they thought that much about it and put them in there, like, always, like, amuses me. So the funny thing about this part is that there's absolutely no reason for Dr. Jekyll to have gone into his office, drank the Hyde formula, turned into Mr. Hyde for a few seconds, and then turned back around and left again. Like, why did he specifically go into the office just to do that? Like, like I said, I'm not really sure, like, why that part was so randomly funny, but shit like that, like, being in the cartoons is why they'll always be funny to me. So in a similar manner to the previously discussed Satan's Waitin', Sylvester sees Tweety and starts chasing him around this kind of similar environment, like containing all these tall buildings. And this cartoon even actually, like, borrows a gag from that earlier short, with Sylvester falling off the building at one point and using Tweety's, like, ripped out tail feathers to kind of, like, fly himself gently to the ground as if his two tiny little feathers were a parachute, which is also very funny to me. But in this version, in this short, Tweety actually flies into Dr. Jekyll's office and hides in the bottle of Hyde formula, which, you know, love that little homophone kind of, like, joke. And that causes him to turn into a huge, terrifying beast with a similar, like, evil cackle to what Dr. Jekyll had. The formula isn't all that chemically stable, though, which was established earlier, like when you saw Dr. Jekyll take it. So Tweety keeps, like, turning back and forth from his normal self into his monster version. And because Sylvester doesn't realize that Tweety and the monster are the same, like, the chase keeps switching back and forth, like, as the pursuer becomes the pursued. Now, at one stage, Sylvester threatens to jump out the window, presumably to his death, to escape the monster. And he says, "I'll jump." And then he kind of, like, turns and he breaks the fourth wall, like, and addresses the audience and says, "I've got a choice." Now, apparently, like I said, as censorship issues, this bit of dialogue was removed, like, in some airings of the cartoon because, you know, censors thought, oh, maybe it seemed like it had suicidal implications. But as I mentioned, the version that I watched on HBO Max left it in there. It's still in there. And I also read that the line is still in there when it turns up, like I said, on Cartoon Network or Boomerang. So I think even though it was trimmed out in some versions, like, it seems like most versions you can watch nowadays still have it in there and it's not cut. I think my favorite part of this short was during one of the times when Tweety is, like, normal size, Sylvester takes him into the office building break room and starts to, like, make a sandwich with him. Like, he takes 2 slices of bread, like, out of the bread box, and then he, like, puts him in between, and he's like, "Stop squirming," and then he, like, puts his sugar bowl, like, on top, like, to keep Tweety from, like, moving around. But then, you know, of course, like, Tweety turns back into, like, monster Tweety, like, while Sylvester, like, turns looking for some condiments, like ketchup or whatever, and then Tweety Hyde, like, eats Sylvester whole, like, only his tail's, like, sticking out of this monster bird's beak. It's, like, super funny. I have to say that, like, the monster version of Tweety is actually pretty scary, or I remember thinking that he was pretty scary, like, when I was little, like, it's because especially, like, he has these dark rings around his eyes and his arms are almost kind of, like, dragging the ground. And I have to say too that even though this short does go with the "it was all a dream" ending, it's still pretty delightful, you know, a really delightful take on the Jekyll and Hyde story. Incidentally, there was also a 1955 short that had Bugs Bunny in it that was also based on Jekyll and Hyde, and it was called Hyde and Hare, and it's definitely worth watching too. Like I said, that was one that I didn't see until after, that I didn't remember until after I'd watched this one, and I said, oh, so if I do a volume 2, that will probably be on there. Now I will say, like, in that one, the character design of both Dr. Jekyll and his Hyde form look kind of different than the ones from the Sylvester and Tweety short, and they're not quite as scary, but it's still, like, really fun, and you do get to see, like, Bugs Bunny, like, briefly turn into, like, a green monster at the end. So this one was released in 1954 and loosely based on Hansel and Gretel, and it's called Bewitched Bunny. And this was the first of numerous appearances by the iconic Witch Hazel, a character that Chuck Jones actually originally based on a witch from a 1952 Disney cartoon, which was called Trick or Treat. So Witch Hazel would subsequently turn up in several Looney Tunes shorts, all of which, spoiler alert, will be making an appearance on this list. I always really, really liked the Witch Hazel character. One of my favorite things, like I like her voice and her cackling and everything, but for some reason, like my favorite thing about her is that and like the fact that she leaves this little cloud of hairpins like behind her every time she dashes off someplace. I don't know why that's funny to me, but it is. So at the start of this one, Bugs is actually walking along, like reading Hansel and Gretel, like in a book, and he seems to be like growing increasingly disgusted with this fictional witch in the story and her, you know, propensity for child eating. And then the fairy tale starts to play out like in real life in front of him. So Witch Hazel she doesn't have a candy house, but she's trying to lure the German accented children, Hansel and Gretel, who are actually like the way they're drawn is like super funny. She's trying to like lure them into her house, and she's promising that like all kinds of like sweet treats, candy and stuff like that. Oh, and also pickled herring, which I thought that was pretty funny. And apparently this works because the hapless little tykes kind of follow along behind the witch doing the same kind of walk that she does, which that makes me laugh too. And they just kind of allow themselves to be placed in this big like roasting pan cooking pot thing, which has this enormous ice cream sundae in it. And the kids are like, woo, and they start like chowing down on it. Now, I will say of particular hilarity here, and I had to pause it so I could like read it so I could appreciate it in its entirety and in its full glory, was they show like a page from the witch's cookbook, and it has kind of like a table of contents of all the dishes that are in the book, presumably. And the dishes are, there's more than this, but like the best ones are waif waffles, moppet muffins, children chops, and my personal favorite, smorgasbord. I laughed so hard when I saw that smorgasbord. I'm like, that's fucking genius. That needs to be a band name or something. So Bugs Bunny, who has seen this whole thing happen, he decides he's going to save the kids. So he dresses up as a truant officer, as you do, and knocks on the door of Witch Hazel's house. Now, at first, of course, she denies having any children, but Bugs basically just like pushes past her, like, I don't have time for your shit, and lifts the lid off the pot. And Hansel and Gretel are obviously still sitting in there, just merrily stuffing themselves with ice cream, going, "It's good, yeah," you know what I mean? Like, because like I said, they have German accents, which is super funny. A lot of these cartoons like are funny because of the voice acting and like the comedic timing, and I think that's definitely the case here, because I love just the utter indignation in Bugs's voice as he like confronts Witch Hazel. It's like, "Aren't you ashamed of yourself, roasting children?" Like the way he's all like fucking up in arms about it. And then Hazel's like, all no big deal. She's just like, call it a weakness, she says. So like eating children. I was like, that's very funny to me. I love that kind of like dark humor, you know. So after Bugs tells the kids what the witch is up to, and they actually run out the house, they escape, they basically taunt Hazel with, "Your butter rides a vacuum cleaner," which I thought was super funny too. Hazel decides, well, the kids are gone, so I'm gonna eat Bugs instead, because you know he's a rabbit. So she actually like makes him a poison carrot, which he just eats, you know, because he can't resist carrots, I guess. It's just kind of like how he can't resist like hot lady rabbits. He can't resist anytime you dangle a carrot in front of his face, even if he's absolutely aware that it's poisoned, which, yeah. So he has like this whole thing where he gets poisoned. He's like, you know what I mean? It's like, it's a really funny like sequence. And then he either dies or passes out. It's not made entirely clear which. And Hazel like carries his presumably dead body and puts him into the roasting pot. But then she goes down in the cellar like to get some relish or something, like to eat with him. And then it so happens that a prince from a neighboring fairy tale shows up and kisses Bugs' hand, which wakes him up, which, you know, Bugs is really appreciated. He's like, "Yeah, thanks for doing me a large," but I think that's what he says, "Thanks for doing me a large. But I think you want Snow White. She's in the next fairy tale over," or something like that. It's like really funny. So at the end of the short, like Bugs gets chased to like a dead end in the house, but he luckily discovers, I guess, something that you would call like a witchcraft ex machina, in the form of like a break glass in case of emergency type box situation. And it has like a magic powder in it. And the magic powder turns Hazel into a hot lady rabbit, which again, like I said, Bugs can't resist those, even if he knows it's like dangerous. So again, you know, regarding censorship, and weirdly, In Canada, there was actually like a long time ago, and I think it was just like one or two people that complained for whatever reason. But in Canada, there was a little bit of a kerfuffle, I guess, about this last scene because the lady rabbit, even though she looks like a hot lady rabbit, she still has Hazel's voice and she still has like that cackle. And so she laughs like Witch Hazel, and Bugs is like, aren't they all witches inside? Like saying that all women are witches inside. Now, some censors, I guess, or some people that complained thought this line was misogynistic. And in a couple of Canadian airings, it was replaced like with something else. But as far as I know, it was never changed anywhere else. And also, as far as I know, it's, you know, it's back to normal in Canada. Like I said, the line was still in there, like in the one that I watched on HBO Max. And as far as I know, it hasn't been censored any other time or any other way. So Broomstick Bunny, this was 1956, and this was actually the second appearance of Witch Hazel, and the first time that she was voiced by the iconic voice actor June Foray. Actually, in the first short that she was in, Bewitched Bunny, a woman named B. Benaderet, I'm not really sure how you pronounce her last name, she provided the voice the first time, but when Chuck Jones first conceived the character, he'd actually wanted June Foray from the start, but she just wouldn't do it at first. But then, like, later on, they talked her into it. So as far as I know, like, up until June Foray died or whatever, like, she did voice Witch Hazel whenever she appeared. So this one's set on Halloween night, and the cartoon is following Bugs Bunny as he goes trick-or-treating, like, dressed like a witch, and he's kind of marveling over what a great racket trick-or-treating is, and, you know, kind of lamenting that he can't do it all year, which I'm like, yeah, free candy, it's awesome. Now, meanwhile, Witch Hazel is in her house making up a brew, as she usually is. This short actually features a pretty cute inversion of, like, the Snow White magic mirror gag. Like, instead of the queen in Snow White, like, asking the mirror if she's the fairest one of them all and blah, 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 Hazel actually wants to be the ugliest, and she even, like, tells the audience that she's afraid that she might get pretty as she gets older, which I thought was, like, really funny. So in short order, Bugs turns up at Hazel's door trick-or-treating, and Hazel thinks that she's a real witch, like a real female witch. Though basically she says, I don't remember her from any of the union meetings, which I thought was kind of funny. The witches union. But yeah, so upon realizing that Bugs in his witch mask might actually be uglier than her, and running in and having this confirmed by the magic mirror, Hazel kind of like pulls Bugs inside and tries to kind of coax some ugly tips out of him, like asking stuff like, who undoes your hair? It's like, he's like, oh, do you like it? Like it? It's hideous. It's like, it's really, really hilarious. But basically, like, after kind of encouraging Bugs to make yourself homely, which was another line that made me chuckle, Hazel goes into the kitchen to make tea, and she actually spikes it with kind of like a beautifying potion, so it'll make the uglier witch like prettier, so that she'll be the ugliest witch again. Once she serves the tea, though, Bugs takes off his mask so he can drink it, and at that point, obviously, Hazel realizes that her guest is not a witch, but a rabbit, and wouldn't you know it, but her latest potion specifically needed a rabbit's clavicle, which is very, very, very specific. So she basically hauls out the meat cleaver and gives chase. So at one stage, kind of all seems lost when Bugs gets captured and he's like tied up from head to foot, but he actually manages to stay Hazel's cleave in hand by making these really big, like, teary doe eyes at her. And then she starts to cry, and she says that the way he looks like reminds her of her poor deceased pet tarantula, whose name was Paul. I was like, what's so random? So while she's crying, like, Bugs kind of hops over and brings her the beautifying tea, and she drinks it, not thinking about it, and then it turns her into her worst nightmare, which is like a super foxy, like, voluptuous redhead. I read that the drawing of the redhead in this, like the hot Hazel, was actually based on what June Foray really looked like. So I was like, woo, hubba hubba, because I don't even remember what June Foray looked like around this time period. But that's who they based it on. So the man in the magic mirror, unable to resist her new feminine charms, I guess, flies out the mirror, like, on his magic carpet and chases Hazel, like, on her broom. And they kind of, like, go out of the house, out of the window. And apparently they fly into restricted airspace, because the last scene is, like, Bugs calling up the local air raid headquarters to, like, report the whole incident. So this next one is A Witch's Tangled Hair. And this was Witch Hazel's third appearance in a Looney Tunes short, and actually the last mashup of Hazel and Bugs Bunny. This one was actually released in 1959 and had a bunch of references in it to like Shakespeare plays. So at the beginning of the cartoon, you have a character that you assume is William Shakespeare, and he comes across this castle with Macbeth written on the mailbox. So, you know, seemingly inspired by this, he starts writing, but then he's kind of startled by this cackling of a witch like from a faraway hill. Now on the hill, Hazel is already over there and she's making up another batch of brew like in her cauldron or whatever. And this time out, it appears she must have captured Bugs somehow like before the events of the cartoon began, because he's already like asleep under this covered dish that she has. So he wakes up and he thinks that the bubbling cauldron is a bath. So Hazel is like, oh, and just kind of rolls with it. Like, so she lets him get into the cauldron. He's like easing his little butt like down into the stuff, and it's like super funny. And she even like offers to scrub his back like with a thing of celery. So Bugs, like while he's in there kind of scrubbing his armpits or whatever, he starts smelling something yummy and then realizes that he's actually on the menu. And then he gets a bit huffy, and he asks Hazel, like, don't you have anything better to do? Rather than like cooking rabbits, I guess. And Hazel's like, well, now that you mention it, like I could be rinsing out a few things, like I guess her unmentionables. But then she kind of like busts out the trusty cleaver, and you know, Bugs runs off and Hazel hops on her broom and chases him. Meanwhile, the Shakespeare looking guy like is kind of watching this whole thing and like making notes about what's going on, like he's gonna put it into play later. So Bugs and Hazel kind of like reconvene at the Macbeth castle, and they have kind of like something of cackle off, which is very funny. And then there's kind of like this adorable reenactment of the balcony scene from Romeo and Juliet, which always kind of makes me laugh, you know, especially like especially Hazel being like, well, don't just stand there like a ninny, come on up, you know. It's like, I don't know why that's funny to me, but it is. So and again, like I particularly laughed at like little details, like the way that when Bugs comes out like dressed as Romeo and like calls her, like the curtains on the balcony are closed, and like for a second you see her like feeling around like behind, like she can't figure out like where the fucking thing is, and it's like just little details like that. I don't know why. It's like that attention to detail like always makes me laugh. And she also like at one point like Bugs asks her something and she answers with "as you like it," which like I said, that's another Shakespeare play. So, you know, again, like all these little references. So when Bugs runs away this time, he runs into the Shakespeare character again, only now like the guy is sobbing and lamenting that he'll never be a writer. And then Bugs gets all mad at him like, of course you will, you're William Shakespeare. But then comes the punchline. This isn't actually William Shakespeare. It's just some random dude whose name is Sam Krubish, he says. But then Hazel shows up on the scene, and it transpires that her and Sam Krubish used to date, I guess. But they lost touch after Sam didn't show up to dinner, like to meet her parents, like however many years ago. And he's like, well, I went to the address that you told me. It was apartment 2B, you know what I mean? So she insists that wasn't the right address. I didn't tell you that. And they kind of argue about it as they walk off into the sunset, which of course allows Bugs to close the short with a to be or not to be gag. Now, like all of the shorts featuring Witch Hazel, this one has a lot of funny lines, like one where she's on the broom and she's talking about modesty is one of my girlish qualities, that kind of stuff. She has like a joke about silly women drivers, like after she's on the broom and she like slams into a wall and she says, I had the silly thing in reverse, like that kind of thing. She also like giggles and Bugs calls her Zsa Zsa, which I thought was really funny. And this one's kind of a hoot too, because you can kind of pick out all the Shakespeare nods like in the dialogue and stuff. So, A Haunting We Will Go, that's the fourth and final appearance of Witch Hazel in the classic shorts, at least. This is from 1966, and this one's actually pretty similar to the earlier Broomstick Bunny, and it even has the same witch costume that Bugs was wearing in the earlier one, but in this time it's not worn by Bugs Bunny, but it's actually worn by Daffy Duck's nephew, who I don't think is named in the short, actually. So the nephew is out trick-or-treating in that same costume. So the nephew, like, rings the bell at Witch Hazel's house, but is so, like, terrified by her that he like runs away. And then later on we see Daffy telling him, oh, there's no such things as witches, and I'm gonna prove it. We're gonna go back to that lady's house. I'm gonna demonstrate she's just like this harmless old lady and there's nothing to be scared of. Before they get there though, Hazel is again mixing up some of her famous potion, complete with eel's heels and diced spider and lots of other yummy ingredients, when she realizes that all she does all day is toil over a hot cauldron. She decides that she needs a vacation. And lo and behold, who should randomly enter the cartoon but Speedy Gonzalez, who very fortuitously like pops out of his mouse hole to borrow a cup of cheese. So Hazel gets real cranky at first, but then she has an idea. She'll turn Speedy into a clone of her so that she can go away on vacation and no one will notice that she's gone. Again, this kind of shit is hilarious to me because it implies that Hazel has some kind of bustling witchery business whose customers would wonder where she was if she suddenly took off. So Speedy gets turned into Hazel, though he still has his Speedy Gonzalez voice and he still like races around all crazy like he did in his mouse form. Hazel is pretty much like, close enough, and she takes off. Meanwhile, Daffy Duck shows up at Hazel's house and Speedy/Hazel like pulls him inside. And then after that, the scene plays out kind of similarly to the tea scene in the earlier Broomstick Bunny short, which I talked about. This time, though, the tea actually turns Daffy into this weird multicolored four-legged creature thing with like bird feet and a flower head and a flag with a screw and a ball on it like coming out of his tail, which by the way is also a flagpole. So Hazel gets back from vacation not long after and Speedy tells Hazel about the duck and he says, I turned him into something, I do not know what. He just says that it's like really in his little Speedy Gonzalez voice. Hazel is like kind of infuriated, like, God damn it, I can't, like, you can't do anything. You'll never be a witch. You'll only ever be a mouse. And so she turns Speedy back into a mouse and he's like, good, I'm back into, that's all he ever wanted to be in the first place. Then she turns Daffy back into a duck, but again decides she wants to eat him because, you know, hey, free duck. And then there's like a brief chase. Now Daffy eventually escapes and runs back into his nephew. And he still tells him, he's like, oh, the old lady wasn't a witch at all. She was just this eccentric old woman who likes to scare people. But then, like, Daffy turns back into the flower head thing, like, without his nephew noticing. So I liked, actually, that this story was sort of like a bookend or almost like a sequel to the other short with Bugs Bunny. And I thought it was, like, pretty clever the way that some shots were reused, but, like, in a slightly different context. Now, I will say the addition of Speedy Gonzalez was admittedly a little bit out of left field, but it was still like pretty entertaining hearing Speedy's voice coming out of Witch Hazel. And for some reason, like I said, it's always the little details, him asking to borrow a cup of cheese made me laugh, even more so because Hazel actually gives him like a regular slice of Swiss and not anything that would go in a cup, like Cheese Whiz or Brie or something. I don't know, like little things like that are almost always funny to me and I have no idea why, so don't ask me. So, Hair-Raising Hare. This was a 1946 short, and this was the debut of the famous big fuzzy red monster with the tennis shoes that is now best known as Gossamer, but actually in this one, he's not named, although Bugs actually refers to him as Frankenstein and Dracula, like at various points. In this one, Bugs actually gets lured to a castle bearing a very obvious evil scientist flashing neon sign on the front by a mechanical female rabbit. You know, Bugs' horniness always getting him into a lot of scrapes, as it does. I do love the detail of the neon sign, though. It was little, like I said, comedic flourishes like this that really endeared these cartoons to me, like when I was a kid, and that still, like, that made them stick with me all this time later, and, you know, that I still find them funny as an adult. So the mechanical rabbit was actually sent out as a lure by a mad scientist who I don't think is identified by name in the actual cartoon, but according to the Looney Tunes wiki is named Dr. Lorry. The character basically a parody of Peter Lorre, you know, obviously very famous horror. He's kind of like a horror actor, but he was mostly like in crime, like noir type of films, like M, like The Man Who Knew Too Much, Maltese Falcon, Casablanca, stuff like that. So Dr. Lorry has been spying on Bugs through his televisor, as it's so called, and he's planning on feeding Bugs to the monster, which is why he lured him to the castle in the first place. So once Gossamer gets unleashed, like the rest of the short, like a lot of these were, is kind of like an extended chase sequence, and it has like a lot of classic gags in it. One of my favorite ones, again, very random, but it's like Bugs grabbing a suitcase and like packing a suitcase and grabbing a set of golf clubs like to flee the castle, even though he obviously doesn't live there. So like he's taking somebody else's stuff, which is just there. It's like really funny. And the mad scientist has golf clubs or whatever. It's just, I don't know. That's really funny to me. There's a gag where like the monster sees his own reflection in a mirror and then like the reflection like runs down, like flees in terror, like down the hallway. And the whole hilarious and very famous bit where Bugs kind of like turns into like a manicurist and dips the monster's hands into like bowls of water and that have mouse traps in them. There's also like some pretty funny shit where both the monster and Bugs like at various times like hide behind and inside paintings like with their eyes poking out. Gossamer gets poked in the eyes like, you know, during that sequence too. I think my favorite gag in the whole short, though, is kind of like the final sequence when Gossamer is hidden in a suit of armor and is kind of like poised with his axe raised, like in this hallway, like waiting for Bugs to come by. But of course, like his red fur is sticking out of the armor, like every which way. So Bugs like sees it, and so then randomly Bugs goes off screen and he returns like on horseback with like a big lance and his own suit of armor, even though he's actually sitting inside it like a trained engineer rather than wearing it, which is, I don't know why, that's again very funny to me. So he slams into Gossamer and Gossamer like hits the wall and gets crushed into a tin can, and the tin can like has a little label on it that says canned monster, and it has even has Gossamer's picture on it. I fucking love that. That's like makes me laugh every single time. So, Water, Water Every Hair. This was 1952. So, when this cartoon was produced, it's actually very similar to, and actually, in my opinion, something of an improvement upon the earlier Hair Raising Hair short, which I was just talking about. I think this short is actually the one that most people remember in regards to like the character of Gossamer. Even though in this short he's not named in the first one, the monster is specifically called Rudolph in this cartoon. He didn't actually get the official name Gossamer, incidentally, until 1980 in the short that was called Duck Dodgers and the Return of the 24th and a Half Century, which is also a great short. Now, the interesting thing about Water, Water Every Hair is that whenever it came on when I was a kid, I always momentarily forgot that it was one of the horror shorts because it doesn't have a creepy sounding title. It starts out like with the normal, like upbeat, like Warner Brothers type of music. And the first bit of it just shows Bugs like sleeping in his rabbit hole, kind of like unaware that his burrow is flooding because of like rain. It doesn't seem like creepy or scary. It just seems like a normal cartoon at first. But then like once the rising water carries the still sleeping Bugs like out of his hole and towards the spooky castle, like, you know, on the horizon, I would get all excited anew because I realized which short that it was. I don't know why I forgot every time, but I did. So the same evil scientist neon sign is flashing on the castle's face. I guess doubtless an advertisement for any passing truckers who might be in need of some evil sciencing while they're on one of their cross-country hauls. So you can see it from the highway, you know. So inside the castle, we find the mad scientist. Now, it's not Dr. Lorry this time, but it's this little greenish, like, large-headed little guy who has, like, a really awesome, like, very Boris Karloff-sounding voice. The voice actor on this was named John T. Smith, by the way. The scientist is actually not named here, but when he appeared in the later webtoon series, like from the early 2000s, he was actually called Dr. Moron. And in various other shorts, he was referred to either as, he either wasn't named, or he was called Dr. Woe, or I think a couple times he was called Dr. Frankenbeans. So whatever you want to call him, the mad scientist, he's built like this massive, massive robot that just needs this one final touch: a living brain. That's what he needs. And it just so happens, luckily, that Bugs floats by on his mattress at precisely that moment. So the mad scientist kind of like fishes him out of the moat, like with a fishing pole. So there's a really funny sequence where Bugs is like freaking out, like when he realizes where he is. Like there's mummies and sarcophagi and the giant robot and stuff. He's like, eek, eek, you know, he's like jumping all over the place. And then like a chase ensues when the mad scientist releases Gossamer / Rudolph, even though he's actually called Rudolph in this, into the castle like to find Bugs. He basically like promises the monster some spider goulash if he completes the task, which I'm like, ooh, yummy. So Bugs is seemingly cornered by the monster when a pit of crocodiles opens in front of him, but he thinks really quickly and sets up an impromptu salon. Like it's probably like the most famous scene in all of Looney Tunes dumb. And he just like starts tisking at the monster about how stringy and messy his hair is. This is kind of like a similar gag to the manicurist bit from Hair Raising Hair, like earlier, but here it's kind of like expanded upon, and in my opinion is like even funnier. Like Bugs really leans into the whole like chatty hairdresser stereotype, and you know, kind of punctuating the whole monologue with "my stars," like saying that kind of stuff, talking about all the interesting people and interesting monsters that he meets like in this line of work. Some of the funniest, like the pained faces, like facial expressions that the monster makes while Bugs is like fixing his hair. like always crack me up. As does kind of like Bugs is like talking and then suddenly he's like, bobby pins please, just like that makes me laugh too. And then he does like a whole disappointed, like he pulls it all up into like an updo. Then he's like, oh dear, that'll never stay, we'll just have to have a permanent amendment. He says like a permanent, but he says it like with several extra syllables. And then like after that he ducks into like a convenient nearby room with a very obvious like high explosive sign on it, and he kind of like comes back and like laces TNT into the monster's hair like curlers, and then he blows the top of his head up. Now, I also love the next bit where Bugs runs into like the laboratory or the chemical storage room or whatever, and he finds a bottle of vanishing fluid, which of course makes him invisible when he pours it on himself. That's what happens in cartoons. Now, I will admit this joke was kind of lost on me when I was little because I didn't realize until I was older that vanishing cream was a real thing that doesn't actually make you invisible, sadly. So upon the arrival of the monster, he actually pours a bottle of reducing oil on him, which of course, as happens in cartoons, makes the monster shrink down to an adorable teeny size. So the monster at this point is sick of this shit. He puts on a very, very teeny coat and hat and grabs his teeny suitcases, which he apparently had on standby for just such emergencies, and moves into a mouse hole, kicking out the drunk mouse and his whiskey bottle who were residing there. But of course, Bugs still has the mad scientist to contend with. So the mad scientist basically like, never sent a monster to do a mad scientist's job. So he cramps Bugs' style by dousing him with hair restorer, because he's a rabbit, it's a hair, it's funny, and making him visible again. So the scientist then has, like I said, he has a great like Boris Karloffy voice. He has this great delivered line where he says, now be a cooperative little bunny and let me have your brain. It's like just the way he says it is like so funny. So he basically then just like chucks an axe at Bugs, but he misses, and then the axe instead like busts open this big jar of ether, and that makes both Bugs and the scientist sleepy. And then there's like a chase, but it's in slow motion, which is like hilarious. Like even the background music is slow motion. It's really funny. So Bugs actually makes his sluggish escape after the mad scientist falls asleep from the ether, and then he wakes back up in his flooded rabbit hole, like thinking the whole incident was a nightmare, until the teeny like Gossamer monster like rows by in a little tiny boat, like still with his little coated hat on. God damn it. I love this cartoon. Every single gag of this is funny. I mean, the mad scientist voice and the dialogue, like the way that he delivers it, are great. And I mean, the whole hairdo sequence, I mean, that's just comedy gold all by itself. That scene is like very famous for a reason. So, Scaredy Cat. This was one of kind of few horror-adjacent Looney Tunes shorts that featured Porky Pig, although I would argue that a case could be made for another short, which from 1951, which was called The Wearing of the Grin, and that one wasn't overtly horror, but it actually had like a pair of mean leprechauns, and to be honest, always kind of creeped me out, so that might be on another list if I do like a volume 2 of this. That will probably be on there, because that one always kind of wigged me out. But Scaredy Cat was from 1948, and it also stars Sylvester, here actually in a non-speaking role, as Porky's pet cat. I mean, which is weird, but like, a pig owning a pet cat is no weirder than a mouse owning a mute dog. Oh, but then also having a friend who's a bipedal talking dog. So, incidentally, this is the first short where Sylvester was specifically given a name. So I guess Sylvester being a talking character like a bipedal cat was like a later thing, because I think prior to this, he was just like a regular cat, like he couldn't talk. But this was the first one where he actually had the name Sylvester. I think there was an earlier short where he was actually called Thomas, now that I'm thinking about it, but I don't think he was named in the other ones where he was. And like I said, he just acted like a regular cat and not like a character. Also, Porky, I mean, to be fair, doesn't usually wear pants anyway. He's actually shown completely naked in this point. Like at one point in this short, as he's like changing into his nightshirt, and I don't know why, but that just struck me as funny. I'm like, oh my god, he's naked, even though he's like a pig, you know what I mean? So Porky has bought this big, like, old house, which he actually perceives as very quaint and very quiet and lovely, but from the moment that he and Sylvester arrive, the cat is like freaked out by the place. So like a bat flies in and like scares the shit out of him, but Porky just keeps scolding Sylvester for being a coward, and he sends him to go to sleep in the kitchen while he kind of like retires to bed upstairs. Sylvester is actually like latched onto like Porky's back though, and Porky doesn't notice for a really long time until he gets in bed and like finds the cat kind of like enshrined inside his nightshirt, and at that point he just like kicks the poor little kitty downstairs. So then Sylvester is actually quite horrified to see, and this was actually pretty creepy, like the shadows and everything. There's like a procession of mice and they're carrying candles, and then they're followed by this other mouse who's pulling a tied up cat in a cart, and then a mouse in an executioner's hood who's like carrying an axe. So yeah, the mice in this house are murderous, and this cat is presumably going to his execution, which, you know, it's a little upsetting. So Sylvester like rushes upstairs and kind of tries to mime the situation to Porky, because remember, he can't talk in this short. But of course, you know, the pig isn't having it. So in an often censored scene, but there in all its glory in the HBO Max version that I watched earlier today, a distraught Sylvester then pulls a pistol out of the dresser drawer and puts it to his head, like threatening to shoot himself. But Porky takes it away and basically like chides the cat, because you know how Porky has the stutter. He's just like chiding him for his histrionic, like ridiculous acting, he says, and it's like super funny. So the mice after that just pull out all the stops, deploying several booby traps, which they've evidently set up in the house like for just such occasions. So there's like a bowling ball that comes rolling down the staircase handrail. There's like arrows and anvils like emerging from unseen locations. There's a laundry basket in the kitchen that has like a trapdoor underneath it that kind of like takes you down to the mouse's like basement lair or whatever. Now Porky actually like narrowly avoids falling into these traps like due to Sylvester's intervention, but he doesn't ever realize like what's going on at first, and like thinks that Sylvester is just kind of like shoving him around and being like a big drama queen. But finally, like a fed up Porky like stomps into the kitchen. He's gonna prove that Sylvester is just being what he calls a yellow dog of a cowardly cat. But a couple moments later, the mouse execution procession like comes by, this time with Porky tied up in the cart, and he's holding up a sign that says, "You were right, Sylvester," which is like actually like pretty creepy. So at this point, the terrified Sylvester flees the house, basically fuck Porky. He just like leaves him in there like to his fate. But then while he's kind of out there trying to get his breath back, this little blue angel version of Sylvester appears and gives him this whole like presentation, like complete with visual aids. He's got like the whole big whiteboard and everything. About how, hey, you shouldn't be a coward, and kind of reminding him how Porky has cared for him since he was a kitten, like giving him food and stuff. So Sylvester is like energized by this little pep talk, and he basically like pulls a whole tree out the ground and races back into the house. So then after this epic battle, which we only see from outside, which is actually really funny because the whole house gets like kind of thrown around like it's a toy, like it's just popping up like that. So then after that, like hundreds of mice pour out of the house and like into the countryside, never again to behead another cat or pig, as the case may be. Then there's kind of like a little coda where Porky is like thanking a very proud Sylvester for returning to the house and saving him. And it turns out though that one mouse still remains, like a mouse who's actually dressed like Napoleon underneath the executioner's hood, and he does like this variation on the, you know, pussycats are the craziest people line, which is actually like a reference to an old-timey comedian that a lot of people don't remember anymore, whose name was Lou Lair, I think was how you pronounce it, but they use that like in a lot of shorts. And so that mouse just comes out, pops out the cuckoo clock or something, and like bonks Sylvester on the head with a mallet. Now, before you say anything, I can't believe that I forgot about all of this, but Scaredy Cat was actually one of a trilogy of shorts where Sylvester was Porky's cat, and they ended up in some scary situation where Porky was like oblivious to any danger that he might be in, and Sylvester had to like keep going behind him, like saving him. The other two in the series were actually, one was from 1954, and it was called Claws for Alarm, which actually took place in a ghost town called Dry Gulch, and also had killer mice in it. And then there was one from 1955, which was called Jumpin' Jupiter, and that one had more of like a sci-fi flavor. Like the antagonist in that one was like an alien called the Instant Jovian. Now that I think about it, like at least Claws for Alarm I think would have been a great addition to this list, like I said, and it's possibly scarier than Scaredy Cat, like if I remember correctly. But again, like I had forgotten about it until after I already did the 10, so I'll have to save it for whenever I do volume 2 of this topic. So Transylvania 65000. This is my very, very favorite of the horror-themed Looney Tunes shorts. This one's actually from 1963 and was directed by Chuck Jones and Maurice Noble. It was the only appearance of the sadly underused Count Bloodcount, at least in the classic cartoons. I think the character like showed up in some later media. Like there was a Bugs Bunny video game from 2000. I think he was in that. I think he was in an episode of Tiny Toon Adventures, and he was also in an episode of the 1990s series, which was called the Sylvester and Tweety Mysteries. But it's really sad that I mean they used Witch Hazel in like 3 or 4 different shorts. I don't know why they didn't use Count Bloodcount in other ones, because he was really awesome. So the title of this short, not to be confused with the terrible 1985 horror comedy starring Jeff Goldblum and Ed Begley Jr., is actually a reference to Pennsylvania 65000, which was a song I guess back in the day popularized by Glenn Miller. So there's also kind of like a little bit of geographical humor here. You know, that was kind of a thing in Bugs Bunny cartoons. He would often end up in the wrong place, you know, after taking the wrong turn at Albuquerque or whatever, because Bugs apparently was trying to go in this one. He was trying to go to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, but ended up in Pittsburgh with an E at the end, Transylvania instead. So after asking directions from a two-headed vulture, who actually refers to him at one point as Crunchy, which I thought was very funny, Bugs decides he's going to go get some info from this imposing-looking castle in the distance, which he mistakenly thinks is a hotel. So he pulls on a noose that serves as a doorbell. This bit was actually cut out of some airings, like probably, but it was in there in the version that I watched. And there's kind of this pair of sinister yellow eyes, and they kind of peek through a slit in the front door. And then like the pupils of the eyes kind of like travel back and forth from one eye to the other, which again is a detail that I still find hilarious for whatever reason. Now, inside, the castle is just I love the design of this castle, like the drawing, the way that they did it. It's just filled to the brim with all kind of little fun minutia, you know what I mean? There's like a TV, like that has a crack, but it has like antennas, like shaped like bat wings. There's a piano with like fangs, you know, like over the keys, and it has a sign on it that says music to croak by. There's like all these family portraits, like, you know, there's one with like a hanging bat that says mother on it. There's one with like Ghoul Scouts, you know what I mean? There's that. And one that I'm pretty sure is supposed to be Lucretia Borgia. And all the doorways and like hallways and stuff are shaped like coffins, which I thought was like a cool little detail. So Bugs actually asks for a phone, and Count Bloodcount like seems to oblige. Bugs thinks that he's the head waiter, and he calls him Garcon, which I think is funny. instead of Garcon. So I thought that was like funny too. But so he is kind of like, okay, this way there's a phone, but then he leads him to a bedroom instead. So Bugs is like kind of like mildly protests about this. He's like, look, I just wanted a phone. I didn't need a room. But then like the count like takes Bugs' whole head like in his hand like that. You can use it. Rest now. Telephone tomorrow. It's like the way he says it. It's like really funny. Rest is good for the blood, he says. And I honestly, I have to give a shout out like to this is also another fantastic voice performance. The voice here is provided by a Polish actor named Ben Frommer. You know, he's being the vampire. I always loved the voice of this character. And I mean, it's just really a shame that he wasn't in more classic Looney Tunes shorts. This is like the only one, and that's mind blowing to me. I mean, I still crack up, and I think maybe my brother used to do this too. When the Count is like leaving Bugs in his room, and he says, "Goodbye, little friend. I mean, good night." And then a second later, like he pops his head back through the door and he's like, asleep yet? And it's like, I don't know why, it still makes me laugh. Even thinking about it makes me laugh. So Bugs like decides he's gonna go along with the plan. He's like, oh yeah, you know, whatever. I guess I could do with a good night's sleep after all. But then like he has kind of like a bout of insomnia. So he starts to read one of the books that's on the shelf. It's called Magic Words and Phrases. Now, unbeknownst to him, the Count has actually snuck up behind his bed, like, you know, this kind of false walls type situation. And he's sort of like about to grab Bugs and like start to drink his blood. But just then, like, Bugs gets to the part in the book about the word abracadabra. And so when he says the word out loud, the Count actually transforms into a little tiny bat, like complete with a smaller version of the top hat that he wears in his vampire form, which I don't know why that's funny, but it is. And then Bugs like sees it, and he just like swats him with a fly swatter, thinking it's just like a really, really big mosquito. So from this point forward, the short kind of goes into like essentially like a magic word duel. Like the Count tries to attack Bugs, and Bugs keeps turning him back and forth, like from his bat form to his vampire form, like at really inopportune times. Bugs turning himself into an umpire, like, is really funny too. He's like, I'm a vampire, and he's like, well, abracadabra, I'm an umpire. And then he bonks the bat Count like with an actual baseball bat. You wouldn't hit a bat with glasses on, would you? Like he says it, he's like bonk. It's like that's like really funny. That's like a particular highlight of that whole sequence to me. I also really like the later bit where Bugs like starts to get creative and he starts to try out like other magic words like abracapocus, pocus cadabra, Newport News, which actually turns the Count into Witch Hazel, and then he says Walla Walla Washington, and then that turns the vampire into like a male version of the two-headed vulture that we saw earlier. So, I mean, Transylvania 65000, in my opinion, is easily the best of all the horror-adjacent, like, Looney Tunes shorts. I love the whole design of the castle and all the amusing little touches in the background. I love the way the Count talks, and I actually, like, really like the design of his character and the way he moves around. He's almost like a little black shadow, like, with all this kind of... It's kind of Nosferatu-like, now that I think about it. And I really like the comedic timing of the interactions, like, between Bugs and the Count. This episode was, like, so iconic for me growing up that I distinctly remember my brother and I often quoting lines from it, like at each other, like the asleep yet? Like we used to do that all the time. And another one we used to say to each other all the time was, hocus pocus, now I crush you. Like we used to say that all the time too. So also I think, now that I'm thinking about it, I think this was the cartoon that actually introduced me to the real city names of Walla Walla and Newport News, which prior to this I had never heard of because I'm not from Washington or wherever Newport News is. Where is Newport News? Virginia? I can't remember now. But I didn't realize that those were real city names. I thought he was just saying random shit when I was a kid, but then I was like, oh, those are real cities. Okay, so that's even funnier. But yeah, so I mean, this one is like creepy, hilarious, and it's educational, and that's why these shorts are still fucking classics to this day. Fight me if you disagree. So that will do it for this installment. Hope you guys enjoyed taking this trip down memory lane and talking about some creepy, spooky, but also funny Looney Tunes cartoons. As I said, I came up with so many other ones that I'm probably going to have to do a volume 2 of this at some point because I'm really mad. I'm especially mad that I forgot that other Porky and Sylvester one. So I'm definitely going to have to make another list just to put that on it. And I'll probably put like the Wearing of the Grin in there too, because those leprechauns like freak me out. But yeah, so there are a bunch of other ones that I wanted to talk about, but these were the ones that, you know, occurred to me first. So hopefully you're not too mad that I left some of them off. So thank you very much for watching. Remember to like and share if you enjoy this content, and please subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Also pop over to scaresalon.com. I have a lot more written content over there. It's all like horror adjacent stuff, book reviews, movie reviews, all kind of fun stuff. So go check it out, and that will do it for this one, and I'll see you guys again on the next one. Bye.